As an elderly fisherman guided his weathered boat across the gentle morning waves of the Florida waters, he noticed a fleeting flash of blue near his fish hold. Cutting the engine to investigate, he cautiously approached and discovered a frightened young boy huddled in the corner, trembling and trying to make himself invisible. At first, the fisherman thought he'd simply found a runaway child, but when he noticed a crucial detail and found out who the boy was hiding from, he knew every second counted. Before we start, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like these stories, don't forget to subscribe. The early morning sun had yet to peek over the horizon as Tom Calloway emerged from his weathered fisher cabin at the small old harbor in the Florida Keys. The salty air filled his lungs as he adjusted the brown fisherman's hat atop his graying head. His wrinkled hands, calloused from years of working the sea, pulled the worn yellow fisherman's coat tighter around his body. The familiar weight of his fishing boots grounded him as he made his way down the creaking dock. Tom's eyes, slightly clouded with the beginnings of cataracts, swept over the gentle waves lapping at the shore. He'd seen this view thousands of times over his 6.5 decades, but it never failed to stir something deep within him. This was his world, his life, the sea and all its mysteries. With practiced ease, Tom loaded his gear onto his trusty boat, the Lucky Catch. The name, once bright and bold, had faded over the years, much like Tom himself. But both man and vessel remained sturdy, reliable, ready for another day's work. As Tom settled behind the wheel in the helm, his fingers traced the familiar grooves and switches. The engine sputtered to life, a sound as comforting to Tom as a lullaby. Slowly, he guided the Lucky Catch away from the dock, the cool morning air caressing his weathered face. The sky began to lighten, painting the water in shades of lavender and gold. Tom's mind wandered as he steered towards his usual fishing spot, about half a mile offshore. He thought about the countless trips he'd made just like this one, the ebb and flow of the tides marking the passage of time in his life. However, just as he reached the halfway point, lost in his thoughts, he almost missed it. A fleeting flash of blue there one moment and gone the next. He blinked, questioning whether his aging eyes were deceiving him. "What the?" he murmured, squinting through the cabin window. Tom's heart rate quickened. He was certain he'd seen something move on his boat, something that shouldn't be there. Instinct honed by years at sea told him this was no illusion. With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, Tom cut the engine, letting the Lucky Catch drift gently in the calm waters. Cautiously, Tom made his way out of the helm, his eyes scanning every inch of the deck. The boat creaked beneath his feet as he moved towards the fish hold, where he thought he'd seen the movement. As he approached, a small sound, barely audible over the lapping waves, reached his ears. It sounded almost like a whimper. Tom's hand hesitated on the latch of the fish hold. Whatever or whoever was in there, he was about to find out. With a deep breath, he opened the hatch. There, huddled in the corner of the fish hold, was a little boy. Tom's eyes widened in disbelief. The child couldn't have been more than 6 years old, wearing a blue vest that looked like it belonged on a cruise ship rather than a humble fishing boat. Despite the nautical attire, the vest was dry. The boy hadn't come from the water. As Tom's mind raced with questions, he stood frozen, his weathered hand gripping the edge of the fish hold. The boy before him trembled, pressing himself into the corner, as if trying to disappear into the wood itself. Their eyes met, wide and fearful, turning Tom's quiet fishing trip into something far more complicated. "Now what in the world?" Tom muttered, more to himself than to the unexpected Stowaway. He scratched his head, the rough texture of his fisherman's hat familiar beneath his fingers. This was far beyond his usual daily challenges of temperamental engines and elusive fish. Slowly, Tom approached the boy, his movements deliberate and careful. Years of battling unpredictable seas had taught him the value of caution in uncertain situations. As he drew closer, the boy's fear seemed to intensify. "Please, no hurt," the child pleaded in broken, accented English. His voice was barely above a whisper, thick with fear and something else. Desperation, perhaps. Tom's usual gruff demeanor softened slightly at the boy's obvious distress. He wasn't used to dealing with children, let alone frightened foreign ones who mysteriously appeared on his boat. But somewhere deep inside, a long-buried instinct stirred, a memory of his own childhood fears and the comfort of a gentle word. Now, Tom said, his voice rough but not unkind. I ain't gonna hurt you, boy, but you've got some explaining to do. He crouched down, bringing himself closer to the child's eye level. How'd you get on my boat, and why? The boy only shook his head, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. Tom sighed, running a hand over his face. His mind drifted to stories he'd heard over the years, tales of refugee landings, of desperate people seeking a new life on these shores. The boy's accent and appearance certainly suggested he wasn't local. Did someone send you here? Tom asked, a note of suspicion creeping into his voice. You trying to steal my catch? The accusation seemed to break through the boy's fear. No, he cried, shaking his head vigorously. No steal, no bad. Tom's eyes narrowed as he noticed something he'd missed before, a small device strapped around the boy's ankle. It blinked with a faint red light. What's that thing on your leg? He asked, pointing to the device. The boy glanced down, his small hand moving to touch the device. Swim thing, he said hesitantly, clearly struggling to find the right words. Tom frowned, his mind working through possibilities. Could the boy be part of some diving group? Had he gotten separated from his parents? You lost your folks, your group? He asked. The boy nodded slowly, a flicker of hope crossing his face at Tom's apparent understanding. Tom exhaled heavily, feeling the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He gestured to his eyes where the thin film of cataracts was visible. Listen, boy, I'm just an old fisherman with poor eyesight. I can't be getting mixed up in whatever this is. He stood up, his knees creaking in protest. I'm taking this boat back to the harbor, he declared. When we get there, you're going to have to go. I can't keep you here. It'll only lead to trouble, and I'm too old for that nonsense. The boy's face fell, fear returning to his eyes. Please, he begged, I stay here, please. But Tom had made up his mind. The idea of dealing with authorities, of being questioned and possibly even accused of something, was more than he wanted to handle. No way, he said firmly. It's back to the dock for you. That's the best I can do. Seeing the boy's crestfallen expression, Tom felt a twinge of guilt. Look, he said, his voice softening slightly. You can stay here in the fish hold if you want. Or, well, there's a cabin deck below. It's warmer down there. The boy shook his head, seemingly content to stay where he was. Tom nodded, accepting the decision. Without another word, he turned and made his way back to the helm, leaving the boy alone in the fish hold. As Tom started the engine once more, turning the lucky catch back towards the harbor, he couldn't shake the feeling that his simple life had just become far more complicated than he ever could have imagined. The gentle hum of the engine filled the air as Tom guided the lucky catch back towards the harbor. His weathered hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. The peaceful morning he had anticipated had vanished, replaced by a swirling storm of thoughts and worries. Tom's eyes, slightly unfocused due to his developing cataracts, stared ahead at the approaching shoreline. He exhaled deeply, the action triggering a sudden, harsh cough that racked his body. The fit lasted for several moments, leaving him breathless and grimacing. Damn it all, he muttered, frustration evident in his voice. His hand instinctively moved to his chest, feeling the uncomfortable rattle in his lungs. It was a sensation he'd become all too familiar with in recent years, a constant reminder of his mortality. As the coughing subsided, Tom found himself lost in thought, reflecting on the irony of his situation. Born a fisherman's kid, he mused aloud, his voice barely audible over the engine's drone. Raised up in the sea, getting old in the sea. He chuckled humorlessly. There's too much of the damn sea in my lungs now. Bet I'll die in the sea too with all this sea in my chest. The harbor grew closer, its familiar sights both a comfort and a source of anxiety. Tom's mind raced with possibilities. What would happen when they docked? Would the boy run? Should he call the authorities? The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, as heavy as the humid Florida air. With practiced ease, Tom maneuvered the lucky catch into its usual spot at the dock. The boat bumped gently against the worn wooden pillars, a sound that usually signaled the end of a satisfying day's work. Today, however, it felt like the beginning of something far more complex. Cutting the engine, Tom took a moment to collect himself before heading back to the fish hold. He found the boy exactly where he'd left him, huddled in the corner, eyes wide with apprehension. "All right, boy," Tom said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We're back, time for you to go." But as he reached out to help the child up, he was met with unexpected resistance. The boy clung desperately to the edge of the boat, shaking his head vigorously. "No, no," he pleaded, thick with fear. Tom felt his patience wearing thin. This was supposed to be a simple solution. Bring the boy back, send him on his way, and get on with his life. But nothing about this situation was turning out to be simple. Frustration mounting, Tom reached for his phone, his finger hovering over the emergency call button. "Look," he said sternly, "if you won't leave, I'll have to call the police. They'll sort this out." The moment the word police left his lips, the boy's demeanor changed dramatically. Tears welled up in his eyes and he began to sob uncontrollably. "Please," he begged between gasps, "I'm scared. Please, please, please." Tom's finger froze above the phone's screen. The boy's reaction was far more intense than he'd expected, and it stirred something deep within him. Suddenly, unbidden, a memory surfaced, a recollection from his own childhood. He saw himself, young and small, sneaking onto his grandfather's boat, filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He remembered the feeling of rough hands grabbing the back of his shirt, lifting him like a misbehaving puppy. He could almost hear his grandfather's gruff voice, scolding him for his recklessness. The memory faded, leaving Tom with a newfound perspective. He looked at the frightened boy before him, seeing not just a problem to be solved, but a child in need of help. Tom realized that he now stood where his grandfather once had, the older, wiser figure faced with a young, scared child. But Tom didn't want to be the harsh, unyielding man his grandfather had been. He wanted to be better, to handle this situation with more compassion than he'd been shown all those years ago. With a heavy sigh, Tom lowered his phone and slipped it back into his pocket, convincing himself he needed to understand what had frightened the boy before calling the police. The boy watched him warily, his sobs subsiding into soft hiccups. "All right, fine," Tom said, his voice softer now. "Let's figure this out." He moved closer, squinting to get a better look at the boy's face in the bright morning light. "What's your name, son?" The boy hesitated for a moment before answering in a small voice. "Miguel." Tom nodded, offering a small smile. "I'm Tom," he said. "Now, Miguel, can you tell me what you're so afraid of?" Miguel's eyes darted around nervously before he whispered, "I need to hide." "Hide far away." Tom felt a chill run down his spine at the boy's words. Whatever Miguel was running from, it was clear that simply sending him on his way wasn't an option. Tom's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. After a moment's thought, he reached for an old fishing net lying nearby in his boat. "How about this?" he suggested, holding up the net. "We'll use this to hide you just until we figure out what to do next. Okay?" Miguel nodded hesitantly, allowing Tom to drape the net over him. As they prepared to leave the boat, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far bigger and more dangerous than he could have ever anticipated. But looking at the frightened boy beside him, he knew he couldn't turn back now. The walk from the Lucky Catch to Tom's fisher cabin felt longer than usual, each step weighted with the gravity of their situation. Tom moved carefully, acutely aware of the small form hidden beneath the fishing net beside him. The familiar sights and sounds of the harbor, the creaking of boats, the calls of seagulls, the salty breeze, seemed somehow different now, as if the world had shifted on its axis. As they approached the cabin, Tom's eyes darted around, searching for any sign that they'd been noticed. But the early morning hour worked in their favor. The harbor was still mostly deserted, save for a few early risers preparing their boats for the day ahead. Tom ushered Miguel inside quickly, closing the door behind them with a soft click. The interior of the cabin was dim, illuminated only by the pale morning light filtering through the small, salt-crusted windows. Tom fumbled for the light switch, and a moment later the room was bathed in the harsh glow of a single bare bulb. "All right, you can come out now," Tom said, helping Miguel remove the fishing net. In the bright light of the cabin, Tom got his first clear look at the boy. Miguel was small for his age, his frame slight beneath the oversized life vest. His dark hair was tousled, and his eyes, though still wide with fear, held a glimmer of hope as he looked up at Tom. Tom made his way to the rickety table near his makeshift bed, where a pair of glasses lay among the clutter of fishing tackle and old newspapers. He rarely wore them out on the water. They were more of a hindrance than a help when dealing with sea spray and the constant motion of the boat. But now, as he slipped them on, the world came into sharper focus. Turning back to Miguel, Tom was struck by just how young and vulnerable the boy looked. He was wearing only the life vest and what appeared to be a diaper beneath it. The sight tugged at Tom's heart, reminding him of his own grandson at a younger age. "Let's get you into some proper clothes," Tom said, moving to an old wardrobe in the corner of the room. He rummaged through it, eventually pulling out a small pile of children's clothes, leftovers from his grandson's occasional fishing trips with him. As Tom handed the clothes to Miguel, he noticed the boy's diaper was wet. "You'll need to change that too," he said, trying to keep his voice gentle. "Can you manage without a diaper? I'm afraid I don't have any here." Miguel nodded hesitantly, taking the clothes with a murmured "thank you." Tom turned his back, giving the boy some privacy to change. As he waited, his eyes roamed over the familiar confines of his cabin. The walls were adorned with old fishing maps and faded photographs, each one a snapshot of a life spent on the water. He wondered, not for the first time that morning, how his peaceful existence had been so suddenly upended. "I'm done," Miguel's soft voice broke through Tom's reverie. Turning back, Tom felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Dressed in his grandson's old clothes, Miguel looked even younger and more vulnerable. The sight stirred something in Tom's heart. A protective instinct he thought had long since faded. His eyes were drawn once again to the device on Miguel's ankle. Now that he could see it clearly, it looked even more ominous. The black band was tight around the boy's small ankle, and a red light blinked steadily. "Let's take that off now," Tom suggested, gesturing to the device. "We're not swimming or in the sea anymore." But Miguel shook his head vigorously. "Can't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Locked." Frowning, Tom knelt down to inspect the device more closely. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen before, certainly not any kind of swimming aid he was familiar with. No matter how he tugged and prodded, the band remained firmly in place. "Why are you wearing this?" Tom asked, looking up at Miguel. "What does it do?" Miguel's brow furrowed as he struggled to find the right words. "Man put on," he said slowly. "Safe for swimming, safe, but—" He trailed off, wincing slightly as he shifted his weight. "But what?" Tom prompted gently. "Hurts," Miguel admitted, pointing to his ankle. "Very tight." For the first time, Tom noticed the angry red marks around the boy's ankle where the device sat. The skin was chafed and bruised, clear signs that the band had been on for some time and was far too tight for comfort. A sick feeling settled in Tom's stomach as the pieces began to fall into place. This was no ordinary swimming device. Whatever it was, whoever had put it on Miguel, it was clear that it wasn't meant for the boy's safety or comfort. As Tom stood up, his knees creaking in protest, he realized that the situation was far more serious than he had initially thought. Miguel wasn't just a lost child or a runaway. He was probably in real danger, and somehow Tom had become his only hope for safety. The weight of this realization settled heavily on Tom's shoulders. He was just an old fisherman, set in his ways and ill-equipped to deal with whatever complex and potentially dangerous situation Miguel was caught up in. And yet, looking at the boy's hopeful face, Tom knew he couldn't turn his back now. With a deep sigh, Tom began to formulate a plan. They needed to get that device off Miguel's ankle, and then, well, he'd figure out the next step when they got there. For now, keeping Miguel safe was the priority. The quiet of the cabin was suddenly interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Tom's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Miguel's panicked gaze. The boy's body tensed, ready to bolt at a moment's notice. "Wait here," Tom whispered, gesturing for Miguel to stay put. "I'll answer it." But Miguel was already moving, scurrying away to hide in the darkest corner of the cabin. Tom watched him go, a mixture of concern and admiration for the boy's quick thinking flashing across his weathered features. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Tom made his way to the door. He expected to see one of his fellow fishermen, perhaps wondering why he hadn't gone out to sea as usual. What he found instead sent a chill down his spine. Two men stood outside, their muscular frames barely contained by security guard uniforms that seemed a size too small. Their eyes, cold and calculating, were already peering over Tom's shoulder, scanning the interior of the cabin. Tom's hackles rose immediately. In all his years at this small harbor, he'd never seen security guards patrolling the area, especially not at this early hour. Something was off, and every instinct honed by decades at sea was screaming at him to be cautious. "Can I help you?" Tom asked, his voice gruff and unwelcoming. He positioned himself firmly in the doorway, blocking their view into the cabin as much as possible. The taller of the two men spoke, his voice professionally polite but with an undercurrent of tension. "Good morning, sir. We're looking for a boy who went missing from a tourist trip. His parents reported him missing, and we're conducting a search of the area." Tom's mind raced. Tourist trips were indeed common in the Keys, but not at this time of year, and certainly not ones that would bring security guards to this small, out-of-the-way harbor. The pieces didn't fit, and Tom's suspicion deepened. Keeping his face neutral, Tom feigned surprise. "A missing boy, that's terrible, but I'm afraid I haven't seen any children around here. It's been quiet all morning." The two men exchanged a look that sent another wave of unease through Tom. The shorter one pulled out a tablet, and Tom's blood ran cold as he saw a map on the screen with a blinking red dot. His eyes flickered involuntarily to the corner where Miguel was hiding, remembering the device on the boy's ankle. "Are you certain?" the taller man asked, his tone dropping any pretense of politeness. "We have very strong reason to believe he might be nearby." Tom stood his ground, years of facing down storms at sea lending steel to his spine. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "Maybe check the boats or ask some of the other fishermen, but I haven't seen any boy." The shorter man leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "Mind if we take a look inside? Just to be thorough." Tom's heart hammered in his chest, but his voice remained steady. "Hell no," he growled. "You need a warrant for that. This is my private property." For a tense moment, Tom thought the men might try to force their way in, but then the taller one whispered something to his companion. Tom caught fragments of their hushed conversation. "Too much trouble, not accurate, few 100-meter radius, maybe in one of the boats." Finally, they stepped back, their faces masks of barely contained frustration. "Thank you for your time," the taller one said, the words clipped and insincere. As they turned to leave, Tom closed the door, leaning against it as he let out a shaky breath. He realized he'd been holding it in throughout the entire encounter. The release triggered another coughing fit, the tremors in his lungs more pronounced than ever. "Damn it all to—" Tom started to curse, but caught himself as he remembered Miguel's presence. "Sorry," he mumbled, clearing his throat. Miguel emerged from his hiding spot, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and concern. Tom's heart ached at the sight. This child had clearly been through so much, and now he was caught up in whatever dangerous game these men were playing. Tom knew he needed answers. He crouched down, bringing himself to Miguel's eye level. "All right, son," he said gently but firmly. "I need you to tell me the truth now. What's really going on? Who are those men, and why are they after you?" Miguel's lower lip trembled, and for a moment Tom thought he might burst into tears. But then the boy took a deep breath, steeling himself. In halting, broken English interspersed with Spanish words Tom vaguely recognized, Miguel began to tell his story. "Cuba," Miguel started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Boat. Sea." He mimicked waves with his hand. "Dad." Here Miguel's voice broke, and he made a slashing motion across his throat that made Tom's blood run cold. "Bad people," Miguel continued, pointing towards the door where the men had been. "Take women, children." As Miguel spoke, the horrifying picture became clear to Tom. This wasn't a case of a lost tourist or a runaway child. Miguel had come to Florida as part of a desperate attempt to escape Cuba, only for the journey to turn into a nightmare of human trafficking and violence. "Those men," Tom asked gently, did they hurt your dad?" Miguel nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "Kill Dad," he whispered. Tom felt a surge of anger unlike anything he'd experienced in years. These men weren't security guards or concerned officials. They were criminals, human traffickers who had already taken a life and were now hunting down a child. In that moment, Tom knew he couldn't just hand Miguel over to the authorities and wash his hands of the situation. The boy needed protection, and somehow, against all odds, Tom had become his best hope for safety. But time was running out. Those men would soon realize they couldn't find Miguel elsewhere and would likely return. Tom needed to act fast. He reached for his phone only to find the signal was weak. Cursing under his breath, he searched the cabin until he found his old satellite phone. It took a few tries, but finally, he managed to connect to the emergency services. As he explained the situation to the dispatcher, leaving out certain details that might make them question his story, Tom kept one eye on Miguel and the other on the door, half expecting the criminals to burst in at any moment. The dispatcher's response was not encouraging. It would take at least 30 minutes for officers to reach them by boat. Tom argued, trying to convey the urgency of the situation, but to no avail. There were no helicopters available, no faster way to get help. "Of course I still need help," Tom growled into the phone when the dispatcher asked if they should still send officers, "even if it takes 30 minutes. As he hung up, Tom felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. For the next half hour, he and Miguel were on their own. He only hoped they could stay safe until help arrived. The cabin fell into an uneasy silence as Tom hung up the phone. The ticking of an old clock on the wall seemed unnaturally loud, each second a reminder of the precious time slipping away. Tom's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan to keep Miguel safe until the police arrived. Miguel sat quietly on a rickety chair, his small frame tense with fear. The boy's eyes darted between Tom and the door, as if expecting the men to burst in at any moment. The sight tugged at Tom's heart, reminding him of how young and vulnerable Miguel truly was. Taking a deep breath, Tom winced as he felt the familiar rattle in his lungs. He coughed, a deep hacking sound that seemed to shake his entire body. Miguel looked up, concern evident in his young face. "You okay?" the boy asked softly, his broken English tinged with genuine worry. Tom waved off the concern, though he was touched by the boy's empathy. "I'm fine. Just an old man's cough," he said, trying to sound reassuring. He caught himself before finishing the curse that usually followed such a coughing fit, remembering Miguel's presence. Pushing aside his own discomfort, Tom focused on the most pressing issue, the tracking device on Miguel's ankle. He knew they needed to remove it as quickly as possible. It was their best chance of buying some time and throwing the criminals off their trail. "All right, Miguel," Tom said, kneeling down beside the boy. "We need to get that thing off your leg. I'm going to look for something to help, okay?" Miguel nodded, his eyes wide but trusting. Tom felt a surge of protectiveness, along with a flicker of doubt. He was just an old fisherman, far from equipped to handle a situation like this. But looking at Miguel's hopeful face, he knew he had to try. Tom made his way to the cluttered workbench in the corner of the cabin. Years of fixing nets and mending boat equipment had left him with an assortment of tools, though he wasn't sure which might be useful for their current predicament. His hand first closed around a pair of fishing pliers with wire cutters, but as he examined the seamless, thick band around Miguel's ankle, he realized it wouldn't be enough. Frowning, Tom dug deeper into his collection of tools. Finally, his fingers brushed against the cool metal of his bolt cutter. It was an old, heavy tool, one he rarely used but kept around for emergencies. Tom hefted it, considering it might just be strong enough to cut through the device. Returning to Miguel, Tom saw a flicker of fear cross the boy's face at the sight of the large, sharp tool. "It's okay," Tom said softly, trying to sound calming. "I'll be careful. We need to get this off you." Miguel nodded bravely, though Tom could see him trembling slightly. With as much gentleness as his rough, calloused hands could manage, Tom positioned the bolt cutter around the tracking device. "Hold very still," Tom instructed, his voice low and steady. Miguel squeezed his eyes shut, his small body tense with anticipation. Tom took a deep breath, steadying his hands. Then, with all his strength, he squeezed the handles of the bolt cutter. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden snap, the device split apart. A wave of relief washed over Tom as he carefully removed the broken pieces from Miguel's ankle. But his relief was short-lived. As soon as the device was off, its red light began blinking frantically, much faster than before. "Damn," Tom muttered, realizing they might have just triggered some kind of alarm. He needed to act fast. "Miguel," he said urgently, "I need you to hide. Get under the bed and stay very quiet, okay? I have to leave and get rid of this item. I promise I'll be quick." The boy nodded, quickly scrambling to obey. Tom watched as Miguel disappeared beneath the makeshift bed, his small form barely visible in the shadows. With Miguel hidden, Tom turned his attention to the broken tracking device. He knew he had to get it as far away from the cabin as possible. Slipping the device into the pocket of his yellow fisherman's coat, Tom headed for the door. Outside, the morning sun had fully risen, casting a deceptively peaceful glow over the harbor. Tom made his way to the furthest end of the dock, his heart pounding with each step. When he reached the edge, he pulled out the tracking device and, with all his might, hurled it as far as he could into the sea. As he watched the device disappear beneath the waves, Tom allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had bought themselves some time. But as he turned to head back to the cabin, that hope was quickly extinguished. In the distance, he saw two familiar figures moving purposefully towards his cabin. The men had returned, and they were closing in fast. Panic surged through Tom as he realized the danger. He broke into a run, his aging body protesting every step. He had to get back to Miguel, had to find a way to keep the boy safe. As he burst through the cabin door, gasping for breath, Tom's mind raced. They were out of time, out of options. There was only one thing left to do. "Miguel," he called out, his voice urgent. "Come out, quick, we need to go, the men are coming back." The boy emerged from under the bed, his eyes wide with fear. Tom grabbed his boat keys from the table, his decision made in an instant. "We're leaving," he said, taking Miguel's hand. "Now." As they rushed out of the cabin and towards the lucky catch, Tom could only hope that his old boat had one more escape left in her. Their lives might just depend on it. The wooden planks of the dock creaked beneath their hurried footsteps as Tom and Miguel raced toward the lucky catch. Each echo of the wood seemed to amplify their urgency, a reminder of the danger nipping at their heels. Tom's weathered hand gripped Miguel's tightly, the boy's small fingers barely able to wrap around his own as he guided him through the maze of moored boats and scattered fishing equipment. The sound of heavy footfalls behind them urged them on, each frantic step a desperate attempt to outpace their pursuers. As they reached the lucky catch, Tom's hands trembled, a mix of adrenaline and fear coursing through him. He fumbled with the keys, the metal feeling foreign in his unsteady grip. "Get on, quick," he urged, his voice strained with urgency, helping Miguel clamber aboard. Tom's gaze flicked nervously between the boat and the approaching figures of the two men, now clearly visible and closing in fast, their intentions dark and menacing. With Miguel safely on board, Tom jumped in after him, his old joints protesting the sudden movement. He stumbled slightly, catching himself against the side of the boat, heart racing as he fought to regain his balance. "Hide below deck," he instructed, pointing toward the small cabin, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside. "I'll lock the door. Stay quiet, no matter what happens." Miguel nodded, his wide, fearful eyes reflecting the gravity of the moment, and quickly disappeared into the cabin below. Tom's heart ached at the sight of the boy's retreating form, a fleeting pang of protectiveness washing over him, but he pushed that feeling aside. There was no time for sentiment now. Survival was the only thought that mattered. As soon as Miguel was hidden, Tom locked the cabin door, the click echoing ominously in the tense air, then rushed to the helm. His hands moved with practiced efficiency. The engine sputtered to life, its familiar rumble a small comfort amidst the chaos that enveloped them. Tom maneuvered the Lucky Catch away from the dock, pushing the throttle forward, the boat lurching into motion. The calm harbour waters began to churn as they picked up speed, and for a fleeting moment, Tom allowed himself a sliver of hope as they cleared the harbour entrance, the vast open sea stretching before them like a promise of escape. But that hope shattered in an instant. A quick glance over his shoulder confirmed his worst fears. The two men had commandeered a sleek speedboat and were in hot pursuit, their vessel a predator closing in on its prey. The powerful engine of their stolen craft easily outmatched the Lucky Catch's weathered motor, and Tom's heart sank. "Come on, old girl," Tom muttered, urging his boat to go faster, desperation creeping into his voice. But deep down he knew it was a futile effort. The speedboat was closing the distance rapidly, its wake churning up white-capped waves that rocked the Lucky Catch violently. Within moments, the speedboat had pulled alongside them. Tom's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting between the turbulent sea ahead and the looming threat beside them. The men's voices cut through the chaos, sharp and threatening, their demands clear. "Stop the boat, old man!" one of them shouted, rage simmering beneath his words. "Give us the boy and we'll let you go." Tom's jaw clenched, resolve hardening within him. He had no intention of surrendering Miguel to these criminals, but as he caught the glint of metal in their hands, guns pointed directly at him, he felt the gravity of their situation settle heavily on his chest. A warning shot rang out, the bullet splashing violently into the water just ahead of the Lucky Catch. Tom flinched at the sound, heart racing as panic coursed through him. "The next one won't miss," the man threatened, his voice dripping with menace. "Stop now, or we'll put a hole in your boat and let the sea deal with you." Realizing he had no choice, Tom slowly eased off the throttle. The Lucky Catch's speed began to decrease, the boat drifting on the gentle swells of the open water, the calm facade belying the chaos that surrounded them. The speedboat pulled up close, and with a sudden aggressive leap, one of the men sprang aboard, his gun trained on Tom. "Where's the boy?" the man demanded, his voice cold and menacing, slicing through the tension like a knife. "Give us the boy and we'll let you go." Tom raised his hands slowly, his mind racing to find a way out of this nightmare. "I told you before, I don't know. Who are you people?" he said. The gentle lapping of waves against the hull of the Lucky Catch seemed at odds with the tension that hung heavy in the air. Tom stood with his hands raised, his weathered face a mask of defiance as he stared down the barrel of the gun pointed at his chest. The man holding the weapon, his eyes cold and calculating, took a step closer. "I'll ask you one more time, old man," the intruder growled, his voice low and menacing. "Where is the boy?" Tom's mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. He could feel the gentle sway of the boat beneath his feet, a familiar motion that had always brought him comfort. Now it felt like the very sea was holding its breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. "I meant what I said," Tom replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "There's no boy here, it's just me and my boat." The man's eyes narrowed, disbelief etched across his features. He took another step forward, the gun now mere inches from Tom's chest. Tom could smell the acrid scent of gunpowder, could see the faint tremor in the man's trigger finger. "You're lying," the man hissed. "We're not fools, you senile old man," the gunman snarled. "Stop with your stupid excuses." Another one of the men chimed in. "We know he's here. Our tracker led us right to you. He was at your cabin. That's where the alarm went off before it went offline." Tom's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the tracker. His mind flashed to the device he had cut off Miguel's ankle and thrown into the sea. Before Tom could formulate a response, a muffled sound came from below deck. It was faint, barely audible over the lapping waves and the hum of the idling engine, but it was enough. The man's head snapped towards the source of the noise, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "Out of the cabin," the taller man growled, gesturing with his weapon. "Show me where the boy is." Tom raised his hands slowly, stepping out of the helm. He moved deliberately, buying time as he tried to think of a way out of this nightmare. The man pushed him roughly, urging him to move faster. As they reached the cabin door, The man pressed the gun against Tom's back. "Open it," he demanded. "Now." Tom fumbled in his yellow fisherman's coat for the key, his hands shaking. "I'm telling you, there's no one here," he insisted, even as he heard a muffled cry from inside the cabin. The man's patience snapped. He pulled back the safety on the gun, the click echoing in Tom's ears. "This is your last warning, old man. Open the door or I pull the trigger." Tom closed his eyes and swallowed hard, thoughts of Miguel, scared and alone in the cabin, flooding his mind. If this was to be his last day, at least he would go down fighting to protect the boy. After all, he was old and sick, and the thought of surrendering his life to the sea felt more honorable than fading away in a hospital bed. What did he truly have to lose? But then Miguel's muffled sobs reached his ears, and Tom knew he had to try something, anything, to save them both. In a move that surprised even himself, Tom spun around, grabbing the man's arm. The gun went off, but Tom had redirected it towards the sea. They grappled on the deck, Tom fighting with a strength he didn't know he still possessed. Somehow, miraculously, Tom managed to disarm the man, but his victory was short-lived. The smuggler, enraged, began to rain blows upon Tom. Fists connected with his face and body, and Tom felt his vision blur, partly from his cataracts, partly from the swelling of his eyes. As Tom stumbled, dazed and in pain, he heard footsteps. For a brief, hopeful moment, he thought rescue had arrived. But it was the second smuggler, who had found the key Tom had thrown aside in the struggle. The second man opened the cabin door, and Miguel's terrified voice filled the air. "Will I die? Will I die?" The boy sobbed. Then, seeing Tom's battered form, he cried out, "Please don't hurt him, he is a good person." Tom's heart broke at the sound. He tried to move to protect Miguel, but his battered body wouldn't respond. Through blurry vision, he saw the men grab the boy. With the last reserves of his strength, Tom charged at the men. It was a futile effort. In his weakened state, he barely made them budge. The next thing he knew, he was airborne, then hitting the cold water of the sea. As Tom struggled to stay afloat, his strength ebbing away, he suddenly heard the wail of sirens. Police boats appeared as if from nowhere, their loudspeakers blaring commands. Strong hands grasped Tom, hauling him from the water. He collapsed onto the deck of a police boat, coughing and gasping for air, his chest aching with each breath. Officers gathered around him, assuring him he was safe and that everything would be all right. Blinking through his blurred, stinging vision, he spotted another vessel nearby. Border Patrol officers, standing beside a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the boy's mother. Then another gunshot rang out, leaving his ears ringing like a flat line. Through his blurred vision, Tom saw the smugglers' speedboat under fire, sinking beneath the waves. Officers swarmed around, restraining the struggling smugglers from the sea. Tom's heart leapt as he saw another officer helping Miguel onto the boat. The boy was pointing towards Tom, his face a mixture of relief and concern. As the adrenaline of the fight faded, Tom felt the last of his strength leave him. The world began to spin, darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. His last thought before losing consciousness was of Miguel. The boy was safe, and that was all that mattered. The gentle rocking of the boat and the wail of sirens faded away as Tom slipped into unconsciousness, his body finally giving in to exhaustion and injury. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled the air as Tom slowly regained consciousness. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion, fluttered open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind, the sterile white walls a stark contrast to the familiar wooden interior of his cabin or the open expanse of the sea. As awareness crept back, so did the memories. Miguel, the chase, the fight on the boat. It all felt like a lifetime ago, but the ache in his body told him it had been mere hours. Tom tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his ribs forced him back down with a groan. He became acutely aware of various tubes and wires connected to his body, monitoring his vital signs and providing much-needed fluids. A nurse, alerted by the change in his heart rate monitor, entered the room. Her face softened with a gentle smile as she saw Tom was awake. "Easy there, Mr. Calloway," she said, adjusting his pillows to make him more comfortable. "You've been through quite an ordeal. How are you feeling?" Tom opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was dry and scratchy. The nurse quickly offered him a cup of water with a straw, which he gratefully accepted. After a few sips, he managed to croak out, "How long have I been here?" "About 6 hours, the nurse replied, checking his IV. "The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your condition. You have some visitors waiting as well. Are you up for seeing them?" Tom nodded, his mind racing. 6 hours. The memories of his rescue flooded back. The police boats, the arrest of the smugglers, Miguel being saved. But it all seemed hazy, like a dream half remembered. He needed to know more to make sure it was all real. As if in response to his unspoken questions, the door opened again. This time it was a female officer who entered, her face a mask of professional concern. Behind her was a small, wiry man in a white coat, presumably the doctor. But what caught Tom's attention was the small figure standing next to the officer, Miguel, safe and sound. Relief washed over Tom like a tidal wave. He tried to sit up again, ignoring the pain in his ribs, his eyes fixed on the boy. Miguel looked tired and a bit disheveled, but otherwise unharmed. The sight of him, alive and safe, made Tom's heart swell with emotion. "Miguel," Tom said, his voice cracking with relief and residual pain, "you're okay." Miguel nodded, a small smile breaking through his worried expression. "Tom," he said softly, taking a hesitant step forward, You saved me." "Mr. Calloway," the officer began, "my name is Mona Eltani, and I'm glad to see you're awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," Tom grumbled, his voice still rough. "But that doesn't matter now. Miguel's safe. That's what's important. What's been happening while I was—" Tom paused as he watched Officer Eltani and the doctor exchanged a glance. The doctor stepped forward, introducing himself as Dr. Patel. "Mr. Calloway, I understand you're concerned, but we need to discuss your condition first. You've suffered several broken ribs, a mild concussion, and various contusions. Additionally, we've detected some concerning sounds in your lungs that require further investigation." Tom waved his hand dismissively, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "I've been dealing with that for years, Doc. It can wait. What I need to know is what happened after I blacked out. The men who took Miguel, they were arrested, right? I remember seeing that, but it's all a bit fuzzy." Officer Eltani nodded, her expression serious. "Yes, Mr. Calloway. Thanks to your actions and the information you provided, we were able to intercept the smugglers. They're in custody now, facing multiple charges. Miguel here has been incredibly brave, helping us piece together what happened." Miguel looked down shyly at the praise, but Tom could see a hint of pride in the boy's eyes. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on Miguel's shoulder. "You did good, son," he said softly. "Real good. Such a brave boy you are." Then Tom's brow furrowed with a sudden thought. He turned to Officer Eltani, his voice laced with concern. "What about Miguel's family? His mother? Have you found them?" Officer Eltani's expression grew somber, and she exchanged a glance with Miguel before answering. "Mr. Calloway, I'm afraid the situation is complicated. We've discovered that Miguel's mother was involved with the smugglers." "Involved? How?" Tom's heart sank. Officer Eltani continued, her voice low and measured. "She was captured by Border Patrol earlier. Our investigation revealed that she had attempted to sell Miguel to these men to repay a debt left by her late husband." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. He looked at Miguel, seeing the pain and betrayal etched on the boy's young face. Tom's heart broke for him, imagining the trauma he had endured. "My God," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "what this boy's been through." Clearing his throat, Tom asked, "What happens to Miguel now? Does he have any other family here in the States?" Officer Eltani shook her head. "We're still trying to confirm if he has any remaining family in Cuba, but we know for certain he has no relatives here in the USA. For now, Miguel will be placed in protective custody while we sort out his situation with the Cuban authorities." At this, Miguel spoke up, his voice small but determined. "No family in Cuba," he said, his accent thick with emotion. "Grandparents, aunts, uncles, all gone. Bad men came, raid, burn house before we left." Officer Elthony nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry to say this, but I'm afraid in that case we'll likely have to arrange for Miguel's return. The authorities there will handle his placement." Miguel's eyes widened in fear. "Please," he pleaded, looking between Tom and Officer Elthony, "can I stay here?" Officer Eltani's expression was compassionate but firm. "I'm sorry, Miguel, but without any family or guardians here, it's not possible for you to stay." Tom, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. What if I took him in?" The words surprised even him, but as soon as he said them, he knew they felt right. Officer Elthony raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Calloway, I appreciate your offer, but it's not that simple. There are procedures, legal considerations, cross-country arrangements." Tom nodded, understanding but undeterred. "I know I'm not rich, but I make a decent living as a fisherman. And my son, he sends me support every month. Between the two, we could manage." Officer Elthony considered this. "It's not just about finances, Mr. Calloway. There's your age to consider, your health. We'd need to involve social services, go through a long process with Cuban authorities, and we'd need to speak with your son, ensure he's on board with this arrangement." Tom felt a flare of indignation. "Now, don't you underestimate the strength of a fisherman," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We work in all kinds of weather, against storms and who knows what else. But," he added, softening slightly, "I understand there are procedures. I'll talk to my son." Miguel, who had been listening intently, spoke up again. "Please," he said, looking at the officer, "I want to stay with Tom. In Cuba, maybe orphanage if lucky. If not, street, like many children." Officer Eltani's pression softened at Miguel's words. She looked between the boy and Tom, seeing the connection that had formed between them. "I can't make any promises," she said carefully, "but we'll certainly consider this option. I'll reach out to social services, see what can be done. And Tom," she added, "we'll need you to give a formal statement at the station later." Tom nodded, feeling a mix of hope and trepidation. He opened his mouth to speak again, but instead, a harsh cough erupted from his chest. The effort left him feeling drained, the fatigue of the day finally catching up with him. Seeing Tom's exhaustion, Officer Eltani stood. "I think that's enough for now. You need to rest, Mr. Calloway. We'll continue this discussion later." As she prepared to lead Miguel away to the door, the boy suddenly pulled free from her gentle grasp. He ran to Tom's bedside, throwing his arms around the old fisherman in a careful but heartfelt hug. "Thank you," Miguel whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for saving my life, for everything." Tom felt a lump form in his throat as he gently returned the hug. "You're welcome, son," he said softly, his voice rough with unshed tears. "You're welcome." As Miguel reluctantly pulled away, Tom watched the boy leave with the officer. The door closed behind them, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts. He sank back into his pillows, feeling physically exhausted but emotionally charged. Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. It was the kind of sunset Tom would usually appreciate from the deck of his boat. Now it seemed to signal the end of one chapter in his life and the beginning of another. Tom's mind swirled with the events of the day, with the unexpected turn his life had taken. He thought about Miguel, about the challenges that lay ahead, about the possibility of becoming a guardian to this brave, resilient boy. It wouldn't be easy, he knew, but somehow it felt right. As his eyes grew heavy, Tom allowed himself to imagine a future with Miguel, teaching him to fish, showing him the beauty of the sea, giving him the stable, loving home he deserved. It was a future filled with uncertainty, but also with hope and the promise of a new beginning. With these thoughts warming his heart, Tom drifted off to sleep. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, he felt ready to face them. For the first time in years, he had something, someone, to fight for, and that made all the difference in the world.